to tell us that a connection has been made. Good evening. My name is Robert Bowen. I've been coordinating the organizing activities of the LaRouche Political Action Committee and the LaRouche Youth Movement here in Ohio and in Michigan. I want to welcome the live audience here at the Wyndham Hotel to this historic presentation and discussion. I also want to welcome those who are tuning in and listening over the World Wide Web. This evening's meeting will feature a presentation by Mr. Lyndon LaRouche and a question and answer session with him. Mr. LaRouche is a former Democratic Party presidential candidate. He is the founder of the LaRouche Political Action Committee that's sponsoring this evening's meeting. Following Mr. LaRouche's presentation, participants here will be able to ask Mr. LaRouche questions directly from the microphone in the room. We'll have a person designated to take your names, and I will call on people. Just come to the microphone when the question and answer session begins. Those of you listening by the World Wide Web will be able to ask Mr. LaRouche questions by email. The email address is info@larouchepac.com. And the email address can also be accessed by the button on the LaRouche PAC web page. Please, when you're submitting your questions, either here or over the internet, identify yourself and the institutions that you may represent. Now, over the course of the last 5 weeks, here in Ohio and elsewhere around the country, but concentrated here in Ohio, 50 members of the LaRouche Youth Movement have been actively campaigning for the Carrie Edwards ticket in the November 2nd election. Devoting their efforts to ensuring what Mr. LaRouche called for when he launched the LaRouche PAC initiative at the end of the Democratic Party convention in Boston, a landslide victory on November 2nd, for reasons which have become, I think, quite apparent to many. One of the most stunning, perhaps the most stunning feature of the LaRouche Youth Movement activities, a feature of what they've done on college campuses, in the streets, downtown, at public gatherings of one sort or another over the course of the last 5 weeks, which has captured the imagination of thousands of citizens in the state of Ohio, and contributed to beginning a process of revolutionizing the Democratic Party's approach to politics. This is by bringing beauty, true beauty, to the forgotten majority, the families who live in the lower 80% of income brackets nationally and who generally do not get treated to anything except ugliness. And this beauty that the LaRouche Youth Movement has been presenting as a gift to the citizens to uplift them, to inspire them, has been through presentations of classically composed musical pieces. We have a choral ensemble of the LaRouche Youth Movement here tonight. They are going to now present you with a sampling of the gifts that they have been giving the population over the course of the past several weeks. So join me now in welcoming members of the LaRouche Youth Movement Chorus. If you've just joined this webcast, you're tuned into a town meeting sponsored by the LaRouche Political Action Committee being held at the Wyndham Hotel in downtown Cleveland. We'll be hearing from Mr. LaRouche, the founder of LaRouche PAC in just a minute. Mr. LaRouche founded the LaRouche Political Action Committee immediately following the Boston Convention of the Democratic Party. In launching the LaRouche Political Action Committee, Mr. LaRouche identified two absolutely essential missions. The first mission is to deliver an overwhelming landslide electoral victory for the Kerry Edwards ticket on November 2nd. There are indications that the potential for that has been created. Part of the negative influence is the absolute hysteria coming from some of the Republican circles, the vote fraud, vote suppression, and various other dirty tricks operations that they are already initiating. This time, however, the Democratic Party, the Kerry campaign, and other forces are ready for them. And we do not intend to allow them to get away with any of it. The second mission that LaRouche assigned to the launching of the Political Action Committee was to free the candidate, John Kerry, and the Democratic Party from the influence of those same synarchist banking circles that control the Cheney-led neocon fanatics of the current Bush administration. We are now only 5 days away from what many people already agree is probably the most important election in the history of this country. We intend to see that first mission accomplished that day, the landslide electoral victory for the Kerry Edwards ticket. Last night, in a public address to a town meeting in Columbus, Ohio, Mr. LaRouche promised that tonight he would launch the effort to accomplish that second mission. So please join me now in welcoming Mr. Lyndon LaRouche.
Just to set the stage, I am asking our people to put on a short video, which I think you will find stimulating and enlightening. The subject tonight is to deal with something that most people don't understand, and to begin to let the American population and politicians begin to understand this thing they must understand now. We are in the worst financial collapse in world history, that is, in modern known history. Very soon, a matter of weeks or at most a couple of months, this entire system will collapse. For example, the US dollar will probably rise to $1.50 a cost for euro. We're going to the bottom. We're facing a general collapse of the housing market, which means that the so-called nominal value of housing will drop to a fraction of what it is presently. The tendency is to lose jobs more rapidly than ever before. This is happening. Now, how do we deal with this? In general, the rule is, as Kerry said in a Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania address some time ago, we have to go back to Franklin Roosevelt's approach to dealing with the Depression. That means that the U.S. government will have to step in, as Franklin Roosevelt did, and put the banking system, which now the U.S. banking system and most of the rest of the world is hopelessly bankrupt. Don't kid yourself. But the President of the United States implicitly, following the principle of the Constitution which Roosevelt used, the President of the United States, with the support of Congress, can put through emergency provisions to take the Federal Reserve System into receivership, under control, and organize it to make sure that bank doors don't close, to make sure that things that have to be funded with credit are still funded, to keep the economy going. But that's only for the immediate term. And of course, the first question is, as we see in Europe today, as the European economies are collapsing, we're seeing in Germany and France and elsewhere the spread of what are actually the measures used first by the predecessors of the fascists and the fascists. The same kind of methods which were used by Herbert Hoover. You know, Roosevelt was not elected because of Herbert Hoover's 1929 crash. Roosevelt was elected because of popular reaction to the disastrous effects of Hoover's austerity policies, which sank the U.S. economy and the incomes of people in the United States by about 1/2. So the problem is, how do we reorganize, having taken those measures? First, the United States government takes responsibility for putting a sick, bankrupt international financial monetary system into bankruptcy. And believe me, if the U.S. government does it, if the President of the United States does it, the rest of the world will just have to go along. Some willingly, some not willingly, but they will go along. We are not going to kill people in order to pay usurious debts. Now, beyond that, how do we recover? Roosevelt had a program which worked. Basic program was basic economic infrastructure. Things that are within the public domain, the public responsibility, as opposed to private responsibility. This includes schools, of course, which is usually a municipal responsibility. This includes hospital and related health care institutions, which is partly private but is regulated by city, state, and federal law. It involves large-scale transportation systems, including mass transportations for cities. And it includes the water systems, which are breaking down. It includes power generation and distribution, these kinds of things. It includes, say, here sitting in Cleveland, you go down the Ohio River, and you take all that coal that is moved down the Ohio River, which much of the nation's energy depends, and this coal's delivery depends upon a system of locks and dams which was set up last about 40 years ago. If those locks and dams start to collapse or go out of maintenance, then the coal barges on the Ohio River stop flowing, and then we have a crisis. So we have to fix those kinds of water systems. We have to take care of municipal water systems and county water systems for drinking water and so forth for people. Public sanitation. These measures, what Roosevelt did is took the obvious needs of the nation and put people to work doing things that were obviously needed within the government purview, that is, federal, state, and local purview. He also did big projects like completing the Hoover Dam, which is a great power project for the whole, and water project for the whole region of the United States. He built the TVA. The TVA transformed an area of dead life, Tennessee, the Tennessee Valley, transformed it into a wealthy area, a productive area, through power and water management, things like that. We couldn't have developed the nuclear weapons for World War I without the TVA. It was the power of the TVA that made that possible at Oak Ridge. If you go down to the Tennessee today or down into northern Alabama, for example, you see the large works that were done essentially then and improved, on which the well-being of what was once a good industrial area of the nation, industrial and agriculture, until they began to shut it down about 40 years ago. This was a rich area of prosperity, and Roosevelt created it. The other thing that he did, of course, was to stimulate the private sector by credit for loan through banks under government sponsorship and supervision to ensure that worthy investors had the credit available to employ people and do things. The employment of a lot of people in infrastructure created a market in which these private firms could prosper. And we have to do the same thing today, but it's not quite enough. And that comes to this. Now, let's take a picture briefly from a few of these illustrations, animations, as to what our problem is. Let's take first this industrial job collapse in the so-called Rust Belt today. You know all about it. You're living in it. That is what you're experiencing in the Cleveland area and the adjoining parts of the United States right now. That's the immediate source of suffering. That's what happened to Cleveland, among other parts of the... All right, now take another case. Look at the industrial job collapse in the state of Ohio alone. Do you see Cleveland on that map? Do you remember what happened to Cleveland in terms of places of employment and opportunities as a result of this? That's part of the job. Just to get a more general thing, let's go out of the industrial area, look at the other area on hotel and restaurant jobs in the state of Ohio. So therefore, cheap labor jobs have tended to increase, and people have been absorbed in cheap labor jobs while they've lost the more productive, higher-paying jobs. And this has been called progress by Ellen Greenspan and by the Bush administration. Now, what's the problem? About 40 years ago, the United States began the process of going to hell. We had been, up until the middle of the 1960s, we had been the world's leading producer society. But then we underwent a change. The change coincided with the launching of the Indochina War. It also launching with people who had who'd come from fairly well-to-do families, went to leading universities, were about to become trained to become the leaders of future society. And what did they do at universities? They took off their clothes, had sex with trees, and so forth, and took LSD. this was considered, and many of them succeeded in rising to high positions in our government, and you see the result of that operation. But more and more we became a post-industrial society. Now what we actually did is we relied upon looting poorer countries. For example, Mexico. We looted Mexico. In 1982, the United States government ran an operation to virtually break the back of the Mexican economy. And the Mexican economy has been broken step by step ever since then. But what did we do? What we did is we said to Mexico, sooner, as we had a lot of poor down there, we said, you come to work for the United States, cheap. Now you look at the conditions of the life. The conditions of life in Mexico today are far worse than they were then. Mexican industries which existed then are gone. We have ruined Mexico. All right, now we have the largest so-called minority in the United States are people of Hispanic language origin. A lot of them Mexicans. A lot of them from other parts of Central America and South America and so forth. But what's happened? We've brought these people in. We've brought them in as cheap labor. We've encouraged them to come in as illegal immigrant labor, because employers wanted cheap labor, and people who are running around as immigrants without legal status in the United States work much cheaper than people who have legal status. We find recently that the increase in employment in the largest minority group in the United States, people of Hispanic language origin, that they're getting poorer all the time. The increase in employment is only among those who've come into the country in the past 4 years, which means they're the cheapest labor. Look then at Mexico. We are destroying Mexico economically with these policies. People say we have a border problem. We have a borderline mentality in terms of our present president. That's what our problem is. So obviously our interest is to increase the productive powers of labor, not only in our own country, but in neighboring countries, such as Mexico. That if Mexico develops, that's good for us. We should have programs of our government which cooperate with Mexico to that effect. We help them, they help us. Now the secret of all this is what? How did we become this great nation? How did European civilization arise to such power after the Middle Ages? Because a principle was understood and adopted with a lot of resistance. The principle was appreciated most greatly in the United States. The development of science, technology, and classical culture in European civilization over the period from the 15th century on, despite religious wars and all the other things that happened, produced an individual who is more capable of sustaining himself on this planet than ever before. For example, before that time, the total population of the planet was about 700 million people. Now we have over 6 billion. How do we get 6 billion people? When in all the times that mankind lived before that, life expectancy was low on the average. Conditions of life were poor. How did we improve? We improved by understanding a principle. In ancient times, before our time, most people lived as cattle, human cattle. They were subjected to the conditions of either herded cattle, like cows, or hunted cattle, like wild beasts. And they had no rights. They were not expected to do much thinking. They were not allowed to do much thinking. They were not educated. They were exploited. The emergence of modern European civilization introduced for the first time a principle. It was not a new principle to humanity. The principle had existed before, but it had not had official status. And the principle was that the function of government is to ensure the promotion of the general welfare of all of the people in the country and of their posterity. And therefore the obligation of government is to serve all of the people. Now how do we do that? Well, we did it partly by education. We did it partly by promoting new industries, new technologies. What does this mean? How is mankind a creature which, if man were an animal, like a monkey or a baboon, the total population of human beings on this planet could never be more than several million individuals at any one time. And this under the conditions of the past 2 million years. How do we have 6 billion people today? When if man were an animal, we'd only have a few million miserable creatures. It's because the human being is not an animal. The human being has a mind, which no animal has. The human being is capable of discovering principles, including universal physical principles. The human being is capable of cooperating in developing and using these principles. The human being, by applying these principles, increases man's power over nature. We're able to transform nature from a brutal form into an organized form. Like our irrigation systems in agriculture, the development of agriculture, the improvement of forestation, the improvement of the conditions of life, the development of cities, which are decent places in which people can live. These are all essential parts of this process of encouraging people to develop, to be educated, to increase their powers of labor, and to go on to create a better society. For many of us, this is the sign of immortality, that we inherit ideas of principle, which are given to us by previous generations, by great discoverers of the past. We learn these principles. They become part of us. We pass these principles on to others. And hopefully we increase the discovery of such principles and make the world better for us. Now, let me just take you into an excursion through a subject of what you might call ecology, but higher than ecology. In the universe, in science, we know 3 kinds of phenomena. One are phenomena which we call abiotic. That is, they are non-living processes. Why do we call them non-living? Because we can explain and master these processes without assuming there's such a thing as a principle of life involved. Secondly, you have processes which are called living processes, which can do things that non-living processes cannot do. For example, take the planet Earth. The oceans of the planet are creations of living processes. The atmosphere of the Earth was created by living processes. The Earth is more and more affected by a growing percentile of the total weight of the Earth is a product of fossils of living processes, more and more. Water is such a fossil. Air is such a fossil. But then there's a third category, beyond mere life, the category of human beings. And human beings, through discoveries of principle which no animal can make, now transform the planet at a higher level than simply living processes. We create a new dimension of environment, which a great Russian scientist called the noosphere, the effects of the creative mind of man, producing things that nature by itself cannot produce. And that's what we are. That's how are we able to have a higher standard of living physically? Is by making discoveries, learning discoveries that others have made, applying those discoveries in cooperation to our environment, to our circumstances, increasing our productive powers, and creating conditions under which people can live longer, live healthier, live better in the future. That should be the purpose of society. That was the intention of the founding of this republic, the United States. And we obviously are far away from that right now. Now, there's another aspect of this, which, when it comes to economy, which is the thing we're talking about today, we're now losing our basic economic infrastructure. For example, I mentioned already the locks and dams along the Ohio River, which are now about running out of steam. They're about to collapse. Why? Because they were designed to last about 40 years. And they were built about 40 years ago. We're losing power systems all over the country. Most of them were developed about 60 years ago, 50 to 60 years ago. and intended to last about 50 or 60 years. In the past 40 years, we have decreased our replacement of these essential sources of economy, just as we've destroyed industry. And now we saw this in the result. We have lost industry. Ohio, for example, was a very productive area for a long time. It was one of the first great states which emerged once we crossed the Alleghenies and began to develop a continental nation. The farms of Ohio, which became the breeding places of the small industries and the larger industries, produced a population of a high standard of culture, very productive. We are now destroying that. What you see in the city of Cleveland, which was once a wealthy city, is being destroyed. What you see throughout Ohio is the destruction of a section of this country. You see the misery to which we are subjecting people. It's like we're going back to the Stone Age. The rights of people are being taken away. There is no right to health care anymore, not less and less. There's no right to education anymore. People say, why should we educate you? There's no jobs for you. Why educate you? There's no health care. You're not going to live that long anyway. You're not that useful. So this attitude creeps in as a matter of policy. So therefore, the issue here is we have to realize that a society must invest over 50% of its total product in creating and maintaining basic economic infrastructure, such as power generation and distribution, such as water systems, such as ecological systems like forests and things of that sort, which are necessary to maintain our environment, to maintain health systems, educational systems, without which our economy doesn't function. These are investments that would take time. For example, today, if we're going to do what we must do, that is, what role the United States is going to play in a world in which China and India and other countries are coming up, what do they need from us? What are we going to produce from them that they need from us? Well, they have technology. China has a high technology industry. India does. But they have a lot of poor people. They don't have enough technology. Therefore, our job should be to take our population, which has a base in high technology, as Western Europe does. We should educate our people up to the limit, our young people. We should provide high technology jobs, not low technology jobs. We should supply the education, the health care that goes with that. Now, to do this, if we're going to produce a nation which is qualified as a labor force to produce what people need around the world, for all these parts of the world. Are we still on signal? If we're going to do this, we're going to have to spend 25 years of the first 25 years of the life of most of our newborn people in developing an education. That is, in developing the skills that go with this kind of role in the United States, in the world at large. Therefore, we have to invest. As you know, if you're parents, you have to invest without much compensation, certainly not financial compensation. You have to invest in that child, that adolescent, that young adult, over a period of 25 years between the time the child is born and the time it has become a qualified professional person emerging from an educational program. That's a capital investment of 25 years, an investment in one generation. An investment, for example, again, is compared to an investment in a power system. Again, 50 years, 60 years. An investment in water systems, 40 years to 50 years. Investment in mass transportation systems, again, 50 to 60 years. These kinds of things. So therefore, what we must do is this. I must do what I do best, is to undertake a program of educating the U.S. population in large in the ABCs of a science which I call physical economy, which is otherwise known as physical economy. Physical economy was actually the concept on which the American Constitution was based. the so-called Hamiltonian system. We have to realize that we must educate and develop the creative mental powers of the individual person so they are a creative personality. The attitude today is more and more, we don't want to educate people to make discoveries. We want to educate them to repeat after me. What is called education today is not education for people, it's education for animals. It's animal training. That's George Bush's No Animal Left Behind. What we need is a different emphasis on education. The emphasis has to be the development of the child. That means, for example, a class size of not more than 25 and probably 15 to 25. Because if you're going to educate people on ideas, you're going to educate by having the class engaged in a discussion of ideas. That means the students are not going to read something, hear something, and then pass an examination. They're going to go through the process of participating in making the discovery which the teacher is leading at that time. That way we're going to generate people who think in terms of ideas, who think in terms of generating ideas, who think in terms of making discoveries. These are the people who can be geniuses. We've done this with the youth movement, for example. That's a whole story in itself, but I've demonstrated to my satisfaction. You take a bunch of people off the streets between 18 and 25, and you put them through that kind of an educational program, groups of 15 to 25 at a time, working together, taking assignments on discovery of original ideas or rediscovery, showing that they don't really know how to pass the examination, they know how to discover the principle which solves the question posed by the examination. I found that these young people are way ahead of many people in universities because they, instead of having learned to repeat after me, they have gone through the experience of making a discovery. So therefore, my emphasis is on the mind of the human individual. We must provide the human individual development of their mind, the creative powers of the mind, not the powers of imitation, not the powers of being foolish, but the powers of their mind. We have to give them the opportunity to live that kind of life by making them productive, by providing them forms of work which are basic economic infrastructure, forms of work which are productive work, particularly more and more skills in it. For example, let's take, what are we going to do with all the young kids in the United States who really have no skills whatsoever? We've got a mass army of unemployed. What are we going to do with them? They have no jobs, they have no training for jobs, they have no culture for jobs. Are we going to let them rot on the beach? Or are we going to do what Roosevelt did with the CCCs, for example? Are you going to create programs in which young people can get into a work and study program where they can become qualified and work their way up? For example, take the state of Michigan, nearby state. You had a famous division in World War II. The division came out of the CCCs. It's the famous division there. So here were people who dumped into the CCCs for this kind of training. And they became upgraded, not merely as soldiers, but when they came back from the war, they were part of the industrial development of this area for that kind of training. That must be our objective at this time. So thus, before we get to this discussion as such, thus my basic program is this. We have to simply start by doing what Roosevelt did. We have to put a bankrupt financial monetary system into receivership for bankruptcy reorganization to ensure the continuity of functioning of our economy. We have to expand the economy to absorb the unemployed to create more employment. We have to start with an emphasis on basic economic infrastructure, which includes education facilities, health care, mass transportation, urban renewal, power generation and distribution, water management, and those kinds of things. We then also have to use that as a basis for stimulating small employers who generally are high-skilled employees. You know what I mean? The guy who ran the machine tool shop. And get more and more of those kinds of jobs working. Using the public employment in infrastructure as a stimulant for the private contractors who work with these kinds of projects. We have to have a target of upgrading our youth in schools. We have to massively upgrade the educational program. We have to aim at a target for secondary schools and higher of 25, of not more than 25 in a class, and generally 15 to 25 as an optimal group for a real learning process in school. We have to restore a scientific education and a classical education in the school system. So we qualify people not only to improve themselves and to develop and enjoy that experience, but to go on to professional careers of various kinds in life. We have to spend about 25 years from now on in rebuilding the United States. But we have to do one thing, above all. We have to eliminate the idea that some of you are the bright guys who are going to run the country, and the others are dummies who do as they're told. That's pretty much what you have now. No? You're going to have a sense that we are trying to get the maximum creativity out of every person. We don't want stagnation. We want scientific and technological progress, not merely because it has benefits for us in society, but because you want the individual person to have the opportunity to participate in scientific and technological progress as a part of their working life, as a part of their experience, as a part of their identity. We must eliminate the idea that some people in this society are condemned to be on the lower level, are condemned to be ignorant, are condemned to be uneducated, are condemned to do as they're told. We've got to get the idea of taking a child who may come from the poorest circumstances, who can rise to the set of being a great leader of a nation. You want that objective. You look at every child, and you say, what can that child become? Well, let's see what the child can do. Let's give that child the stimulus and opportunity to do so. Let's do the same thing with people at work. Give them jobs in which they have a chance to progress, and do that with the aid of technological and scientific progress. Give them a sense of being meaningful in their community. Give them a sense of participating, not as people who learn how to get along with the society, but people who are citizens of society, who actually collectively make the decisions, are part of the deliberation process which settles the policy of the nation. You know, past period, we've had over 40 years, especially since 1977. We've had a degeneration in the United States where the income levels of the lower 80 percentile of family income groups has been dropping progressively more and more. You see it, you know it. This was a deliberate policy, a post-industrial utopia. What we've done is these people who are in the lower 80% more and more flee from reality because they don't think they really have any power. When they vote, they don't think they have any power. They think they have the power to beg and threaten. You give me my vote, I'll give you my vote, you give me something. So they're not thinking about their taking responsibility for saying how the country should be run, how their city should be run. They're thinking about how they can get by intimidating or begging from authority. And you have a society in which the upper 20% thinks they run the society. They think the lower 80% are just conveniences. They don't understand what a human being is. And therefore, we've had a problem which has led to this crazy election situation with Bush. If we'd been a sane society, Bush could never have been elected or even appointed. The man is mentally ill and stupid. How could honest citizens think of voting for such an idiot? But you find in the lower 80% of family income brackets, among people who are not in the worst income brackets, who are between the ages of 30 and 50. And you find among these religious fanatics who admire Bush because he doesn't ask them to look at reality. He gives them fantasy. He said, I don't have to have a brain. I got my orders from God. And you have people who believe that. What we have done is we have not only have we oppressed people in the lower 80%, physically and otherwise, what we have done is destroyed their minds and souls by taking away from them the sense of a rational responsibility as citizens for what happens to our society. We've put them outside society. And if they behave like crazy people, let's not be surprised. We ask them to behave that way. We took away meaningful employments. We shut down the farms, the private farms. We shut down the industries. We ruined the communities. And they're sitting out there in churches and so forth, and they're going crazy. They're outside the real world, living in a fantasy life, hoping the Battle of Armageddon will come so they won't have to pay their rent next month. That kind of thing. We did that to our people. And we have to ensure, if we want to maintain a republic, that we have citizens where every citizen, including all of the lower 80 percentile, see themselves as citizens, as someone who is actually involved in deciding what the nation will do. They don't have to decide exactly what the nation will do, but they have to have a voice in the process of debate which determines what the decision will be. We have to change ourselves back to becoming a true republic. And therefore we have to put the emphasis on the notion that man is not an animal. He's not a doggy. He's not a cat. He's not a monkey. Man is a thinking creature, the only thinking creature apart from God in the universe. Every individual contains that divine quality of the power of creativity, which no animal has. Every person is sacred. And our job in life, and our job in politics, is to provide for every individual the opportunity to express that divine quality in themselves in some manner of their choice, to give them the access to the education, to the opportunity to do that, to be a society of ideas, not a society of blind passions. Thank you.
We're now opening up the discussion here for questions. People in the room assembled here at the Wyndham Hotel, if you have a question, please line up at the microphone in the middle of the room, and Dan Sturman will take your name, and then I'll call you in order to come back to the microphone to ask your question. Let me take the opportunity now, while people are assembling back there, to announce to listeners on the World Wide Web that you are tuned in to a town meeting being held at the Wyndham Hotel in downtown Cleveland in Ohio, being sponsored by the LaRouche Political Action Committee. We've just heard an address by Mr. LaRouche, and in a moment we will be opening up the floor for questions. Before I take the first question, there are a couple of announcements that I would like to make. One of the first steps that everyone in this room can help us take in implementing what Mr. LaRouche just said, which we have been in sort of in an intense effort over the last 5 weeks to carry out, is to bring the forgotten men and women, the poor, the people who are usually neglected by everybody, onto the stage of the political debate in the United States today. Not merely by casting their vote on November 2nd, but by becoming part of an informed citizenry that is going to guide a Kerry Edwards administration in making the right decisions as the crises hit, which that administration is going to be confronted with starting on November 3rd. Not in January, but on November 3rd. We have been circulating large volumes of pamphlets, leaflets, other literature over the course of the last 5 weeks, and I'm inviting you tonight to help us carry this the next step. One of these pamphlets, which is both an outline of the crisis conditions, sort of a summary of a couple of case studies of that, and an outline of the measures that Franklin Roosevelt took back in the 1930s to solve the Depression back then. We have a fairly large quantity of these pamphlets available at the table outside. I encourage everyone to take 2, 3, 4, 5 bundles or more. There are 50 pamphlets in each bundle. Take these to your neighborhood, take them to the grocery store, take them to work, give them out in Republican neighborhoods. Not every Republican is an axe-murdering fascist. They want, you know, the future for their children as much as good Democrats do. There are also a series of leaflets on the table, all of which address one of the hottest issues which has come up in the course of the campaign, one which Mr. LaRouche has earlier identified could pound the final nail in the coffin of the Cheney-Bush gang in Washington, D.C., and that is the scandal around the flu epidemic and the shortage of vaccine to deal with it. The first leaflet that we put out for distribution nationwide addressing this is the one I'm holding up right now, entitled, LaRouche, Bush-Cheney could cause more Americans to die of the flu than were killed in the 9/11 attack. There were 500,000 copies of this leaflet that were circulated nationwide. The second leaflet, following George Bush's performance in the third debate, in which he stood before the world and said that he wasn't going to get a flu vaccine and people should basically chill out and not be so worried about it, following which he made it clear in a private meeting with Republican fundraising big shots that one of the top priorities of his administration would be to privatize Social Security. In other words, steal the Social Security Trust Fund and hand it over to the management experts on Wall Street, who happen to also be the financial darlings behind the Cheney-Bush campaign. In response to this, Mr. LaRouche authorized the release of a second leaflet on the flu crisis entitled, President Bush to Americans, Drop Dead. There are thousands of these leaflets available still at the table outside. I encourage you to take a bundle of these with you along with the pamphlets. The third leaflet, which is in production today, is being shipped to various regions around the country, including here. I expect to have them sometime later in the day tomorrow afternoon, is the latest in the series based on some of the further evidence that's come out of the administration's cover-up going back at least a year of this flu pandemic. And the title of the third leaflet, which might strike your imagination, is Go Flu Yourself, which is the Cheney-Bush challenge to the American population. So with that, may I have the list from the room here? Dan? You've been bringing the list up. While I'm waiting for that, I do have a number of questions that have come in from the World Wide Web. I'll start with one of those. Lynn, this question comes from Richard Hughes. The subject is Haiti, and the question very simply is, why is U.S. foreign policy towards Haiti so belligerent?
There is no particular reason why the United States should be belligerent to Haiti, but the policy of the United States toward Haiti is just built into the system. We just keep doing it. We don't change it. And remember that this became more acute in the middle of the 1970s, when Henry Kissinger, who was not the only goat in this thing, but he did it in particular, others as well. Kissinger said that the future of mankind will be determined by who controls raw materials. And he said, well, that Africa has a lot of raw materials, and therefore the Africans are consuming those raw materials, and therefore we should not only discourage the Africans from raising their productivity, because they would use more of these materials, which are ours for our future, but also the African population should be reduced in order to save materials which the Africans might consume. we're now in a situation where you have four powers which are determining the war materials destiny of the world. Most of the speculation in the price of petroleum has nothing to do with shortages of anything. It has to do with financial speculation in petroleum and other raw materials. The four powers are the United States itself, Western and Central Europe, including the British Isles, Russia, which is also an important factor in raw materials, and China, which is not a factor in raw materials production, but is a factor in raw materials consumption, and is the biggest bidder on raw materials in the world today. So we're in that kind of situation where everything is being destroyed. You see it here in the United States. That policy is running the United States. We are destroying everything, but people in Wall Street and finance are investing in profits on speculation in control of raw materials. And there's a fight around the world to say who's going to control the world's raw materials, which goes back from 1975 with this Kissinger policy statement, NSM 200. So in the case of Haiti, you have a country where the United States policy, not entirely, not every part of the United States, but people in the State Department and elsewhere say, no, it would be better if they died out and just don't make it too messy if possible. Don't be embarrassed. Don't let us be embarrassed by it. But the United States, which could have done something about Haiti, has done nothing. Clinton had to deal with it. But nothing has happened, in effect. It's worse than ever. And it's getting worse. And the reason it's getting worse is because we don't care. And that's the, I mean, there are many other explanations of the Haiti situation, but it's that simple. We don't care. We care about people who say, these guys are on our side, we take care of them. These guys are either not on or on the opposite side, or they're not on our side, so therefore we dump them. It's just a completely inhuman, bestial attitude toward human beings.
Before I take the next question, let me just announce that further information, including orders for leaflets and pamphlets, can be made through the lpac website, which is www.lpac.com, and also through the lpac toll-free number, which is 800-929-7566. The next question, Nick Fedden.
Okay, well, I don't exactly have a question here tonight. I'm actually here to read a statement from somebody who was supporting this town hall meeting and could not make it because of a class he had to teach. He's Dr. Michael Williams of Cleveland State University, Director of the African American Studies Department. So I'm going to read you his statement. He said, "Unfortunately, I cannot be with you tonight. Other commitments prevent me from joining you for this important event. We are facing the most important election in the history of this country. The winner of this election will establish a course of action that will affect us and many future generations. This election is not just about who's president, but rather it's about who will make decisions concerning Supreme Court appointments, health care, Social Security, the environment, etc. No one can afford to be neutral or not involved in this election. The battle lines have been clearly drawn. I have chosen to support John Kerry because I believe that he is the clear choice in this election. We cannot afford another 4 years of George W. Bush. President Bush has consistently demonstrated that he does not operate in the best interest of poor, working, and middle-class individuals. His policies leave the elderly vulnerable, children at risk, and the poor left behind. It is clear that Mr. Bush must be returned to his ranch in Texas. He has failed the ultimate test of leadership. He does not provide security for the most vulnerable of our society. I wish you success in your event tonight. Continue to encourage individuals to support the election of John Kerry. When we have accomplished the goal of electing Kerry, then we will face the task of holding Senator Kerry accountable to people who worked so hard for his election."
Delight is Goshnor?
Golkenauer.
Gogenauer.
Well, thank you, Mr. LaRouche, for your time. As far as I'm concerned with the debate, John Kerry was the winner. Even though at this point I am still undecided in this election, and I'm also not as an accomplished speaker as you are, so I got to cheat. I don't mean for what I am about to ask to be a negative statement towards Mr. Kerry, but I need more information about the man, John Kerry, in order to make my decision next Tuesday. I would ask the same of Mr. Bush or his representative as well. I have seen many and heard many negative visual and audio ads against both Mr. Bush and Mr. Kerry. Even though these ads have sources that give credibility to them, this mudslinging does annoy me. Now again, this is not a negative question. This is a tool that I am using, as well as a bit of a concern. How can I trust Mr. Kerry as a man, not the politician, who wishes to be president, when he allows visual and audio behavior that I won't even allow my 7-year-old grandsons to do?
Okay. Well, the point with John Kerry is we have to elect him, because if we don't elect him, we're going to get Bush. And if you get Bush, you are not going to find the planet worth living on. Therefore, the problem then is not a question of what John Kerry and himself. He's on the screen. He's there. Forget the mudslinging as such. I don't worry about mudslinging. I had this fellow, Tom DeLay, just ran a blast against me in Texas, and that shows you how desperate this. You want to talk about a degenerate, a guy who's really degenerate? Tom DeLay, the leader of the House of Representatives. I can't think of a man who is more corrupt and more disgusting than he is. Oh, there are a few. I wouldn't want to mention their names though. But John is a clean character himself. He's explained his views. They're credible, they're plausible on these matters. But the responsibility lies not with him, but with us. We instead of just looking at the selection of a president as dumping a ballot in a box, we have to look at our relationship to the elected president as an ongoing relationship, where we are going to, through organization of a political process, we are going to intervene so that our voice is heard. For example, I have problems. The question is Kerry going to take on the bankers? I know the United States very soon is going to be foreclosed on by international finance. You're going to find a sudden zooming of the cheapening of the dollar, which is now, the euro is now $1.29. It'll probably be $1.50 soon. Petroleum is now at $1.55. $55 a barrel. It will soon be 75. It will soon then, after that, be 100. These are the things that are going to hit the United States and the Kerry administration, even before Kerry was inaugurated. So therefore, how is he going to react to this? Is he going to try to make a deal with the bankers, with the loan sharks, as was being done in Europe now, in France and Germany? Germany with the Hartz IV, in France with the new chief of the party? Or is he going to stand up as Roosevelt did? He said he would use the Roosevelt precedent. Is he going to do it? I would hope so. My job, and your job, in a sense, the same sense, I have more clout, so we say, but it's your job too. We have to ensure that we maintain an active control over our president in the way we can do it. We cannot be people who walk away from an election, cast a vote, and then go out in the street and complain. We have to be actively organized. For example, the Democratic Party of this country, before the 1970s, used to have an organization. It was an organization based on local organizations all the way up. The Democratic Party, if you were active in a party local, a party chapter, you had influence all the way up. We have people now who don't have, except at election time, have very little involvement in party affairs. They do not exert their right as citizens through party channels. And that's the only answer. If you've got a perfect man, I don't think John is a perfect man. He's a man of intelligence. He's a man of distinction. But he, too, may have follies here and there. So therefore, our job is not to leave it up to him to decide. But if you vote for him, then you're accountable for him. And you have to take the attitude of intervening to make sure he stays accountable.
Lynn, I have a pretty long list of questions here. How much time do you have?
Well, let's try to see what we can do of getting through this, and I'll try to shorten the answers unless I get a real one that requires more.
Very good, very good. Diba Salimi?
Hi, Lynn. Hello? Okay. My question about is this animation thing. I don't know how to bring the animation into streets. I was coming up with the crazy solutions to create such models, but I don't know really how to present it on the streets.
What you have to do, you have to get the thing in your mind first. It's not a matter of getting a technique from me on how to do it. You have to have the concept of animation in your mind, and then you'll be able to communicate it to other minds. Let me give you an example. The prime example for animation, for your purposes and that of other people in the youth movement and so forth, is what? Let's take the discovery of gravitation by Johannes Kepler, as reported in 1609 in his book, The New Astronomy. Now, there were three things about his observations which led him to define a principle of gravitation as distinct from some textbook formula. First of all, the orbit of Mars and the orbit of Earth were elliptical, not circular. Secondly, the movement of the planet along the orbit was constantly varying. That is, the velocity of the motion of the planet was constantly varying as it moved, not uniform. Thirdly, the way in which this motion was controlled was this equal area, equal times. Now, this meant that there is no direct way of simply mathematically representing this as some kind of a gimmick. So therefore, now what does this mean? It means that the planet Earth does not generate an orbit. In other words, the Earth is not pushed by something and then generates an orbit by being pushed. The Earth is following an orbit which existed before the Earth started moving. Right? So therefore, the Earth is controlled by a force, by a power outside the orbit. This power is gravitation. Now, therefore, what you're seeing when you're seeing the Earth move in its orbit, you're seeing animation. Animation is not push-pull. Animation is a principle which is acting constantly in an area to cause effects to follow a certain pattern. Now, the same thing is true in economics, the same principle. For example, what is the relationship between the development of a certain technology in basic economic infrastructure and the technology in the mind of the individual who is the operative in industry? I'll give you another example. Let's take the case of rural electrification, which was done under the influence of Roosevelt. Rural electrification changed the American farm, but it didn't change it so much directly. It changed it indirectly. The availability of electricity changed the way people farmed, despite the fact that they did not change much in the way they farmed. So the question is to know is what is the relationship between the principle of electrical power and the increase of the productive powers of labor of the farmer, of the American farmer. What's the difference, for example, what is the principal connection between providing a competent kind of classroom structure for students in schools and the development of their minds in such a way that they become more productive and therefore have a more productive society? So therefore, what you're looking at in animation is how do you structure your environment, restructure the environment in such a way that you actually involve a principle, and this principle makes things happen. See, people think I hit something, I push something. Well, yes, that sometimes has an effect. But the changes, the increase in productive powers of labor does not come from just that. The increases in productive powers of labor in society comes from improvement. It comes from improvement in environment largely. And that's what we have not paid attention to. We have not paid attention to infrastructure. We haven't paid attention to education, to health care, to power supplies. We have inferior power supplies instead of superior ones. We haven't paid enough attention to investment in water systems, these kinds of things. We haven't, what's the effect of health care, of denying it or providing it? What's the effect of the improved health of the citizen on the productivity of labor in society? We used to treat that seriously until about 40 years ago. Then it was important to maintain health care not only for the person, but for the person's productivity. We didn't want valuable people to die, not just for humane reasons, but they were useful people. You don't want them dying out on you. So that's the way we have to approach this, is get this concept. There are principles. And what I'm doing is what some of you know is the same thing I do when I insist that young people begin their orientation in science on a university level by solving a problem posed by Carl Gauss in 1799, which is the definition of the so-called complex domain. And therefore, these kinds of discovery exercises in discovering principle, so that most people don't know what a principle is. And the process of animation is a way of illustrating, which has to be made clear to people that there's a principle involved, what the principle is. We have, for example, we are going to invest in building things which will have a life of about 40 to 50 years. How do we know at the time that we're investing that it's worthwhile making that investment, or putting a priority on that investment? You know, we're going to start the thing, we've got a project, you're building something. Say you're building a power plant. A power plant takes 3 to 5 years to build. How do you know when you start that power plant that an improved technology in that power plant is going to be of value to society in the future? You have to adduce the principle involved, which assures you that this is a good investment by society. That is, you are depriving yourself of eating up this income because you're putting some of the income aside to invest in this project. Why should you invest in this project rather than simply consume that income? These are the kinds of questions which have to be faced in economy. And you see some of the debates in the legislature, you see how idiotic they become on precisely these issues. This is not taken into account. And I think the main instrument here is young people, 18 to 25 in particular, those who are going through the youth movement experience, will be able to develop the knowledge themselves of what animation is. And like teachers, will be able to make clear in discussion with others what this term animation means to the minds of others. So it's an educational process, which I can explain, but explanation is not enough. You have to actually communicate to people what it means.
Lynn, I have a question from the internet from Greg Croft. He says, "Hi, Mr. LaRouche. My name is Greg from Los Angeles, California. The president of Argentina has clearly decided to put the bank first and the people of Argentina second. This decision is insane. To put the people of Argentina in this condition is an act of treason. Why is he being such a victim to the bankers? Why doesn't he print his money and get production going in Argentina? Are the bankers preventing him from doing this, or does he just not know what to do? I know a lot of people in Argentina are listening to this broadcast, and they need to know the options. Please help them understand so they can better help their country."
Fine.
Thank you.
Okay, Argentina is a victim country. The victim has gone as far as it dares so far in resisting the Freddy Krueger's mother, Annie Krueger. who is the IMF negotiator in that area. The responsibility for the freeing of Argentina from this obligation lies with the United States, not with the people of Argentina. The people of a country must do the best they can to defend themselves. Just like the people of a neighborhood in the United States sometimes do the best to defend themselves. But sometimes the thing involves a higher authority. We, the United States, represent one of those higher authorities which determines the fate of whole groups of nations. Therefore, it should be on our conscience. And I take that seriously. I do something about it. I am doing something about it. And to the extent I'm supportive of the United States will tend to do something about it. I fought this issue for a long time. And that's the way it has to be. Don't ask the poor guy out there on the life raft to steer a course to safety. Sometimes you have to rescue him. We are responsible for what is being done to Argentina. Our nation is one of the powers that's doing it. We're committing a murderous crime against the people of Argentina, and we have been doing it for some time. Therefore, it is our responsibility to try to stop our government and others from condoning this kind of crime. And when the people of Argentina cry out, as they did cry out in a sense personally to me, there is a film which is rather popular in Argentina today, which is being broadcast in the theaters, and we will probably get a copy for our just private review here. But this film features my remarks on this subject, and this film is very important, very popular in Argentina right now, and will be more popular, I think, as time goes on. But the main thing is, these kinds of things, we are responsible. We are a powerful nation. We are the citizens of a powerful nation. How do we get our nation to do what it can do to free another nation from genocide?
Ernie Harris.
Mr. LaRouche, how are you? My name is Ernie Harris. I'm president of Black on Black, which is a local grassroots organization of Cleveland. I'm also a friend of James Bevel, whom I know you know well. This evening, I just want to ask you, being a member of a local organization, what do you see local organizations doing in relationship to Cleveland being one of the poorest cities in the nation? What are some of the things we should be doing here on a local level?
Well,
Thank you.
First of all, we have to get some power at the national level. I think if Bill Clinton has any influence in the coming administration, that will happen. I think we've touched the conscience of a lot of people who are turning out. I mean, this is a very important election. The degree to which a mass turnout is developed. I mean, just go through this thing, because you've asked actually a practical question more than a principal question. Look, what's happened is we're having a turnout of the people under 29. The report now is under 29 voters are 65% voting for Kerry. That's not bad. Right? We're having among senior citizens, not just senior citizens, but from about 50 up, are also tending to go for Kerry. Now, one suggestion of this is that people over 50 in this country actually experienced the civil rights movement, whereas those under 50 did not. So they don't have that kind of conscience. We have the people in the 30 to 50 age group tend to be indifferent. They are a complete entertainment society organization, and if they don't have entertainment on television and sex, they're having their entertainment at some crazy revival meeting of Elmer Gantry and company, right? And these are the nuts that are voting for Bush. I mean, the highest percentile turnout for Bush is among people in that 30 to 50 age group, which is sort of a lost generation, but a generation of 20 years of our population. So our problem here is to build a coalition within the population which realizes we have a sickness in the population, and which realizes at the same time that we have to fight to reindustrialize and redevelop areas of the United States. And Cleveland is obvious. Why? You've got the labor force here. You've got in Michigan the labor force still left here. In Ohio generally, the labor force is still there. You have the people who have the culture which is prepared to step in and maintain large industries and technological progress. We have the needs, for example, practical projects, education. We used to have a great medical system in Cleveland, which has been come on hard times as a result of the bankrupting of the city. So you have all these things which should be done. So we need a combination of, which is based on an approach. We need a combination of citizens all over the country coming to a common objective. You have people who are under 29, 65% are all on your side effectively, right, to begin with. You have people who are older, who have a conscience, who are concerned by this mess we have now. We have people in between, many of whom are crazy. They're just not in the real world. But not all of them are crazy. So therefore, if we coalesce, if we develop a conception of what we, as we, can do, then every part of what we are can work. Now, the main thing, for example, you have an organization in Cleveland. Well, how does it connect to other organizations in Cleveland and elsewhere so that we can have some concerted force on the situation? How can we have discussion groups which work on very specific projects to find specific projects which will work, which can be financed, or we can argue for financing to get improvements going? How can we act together to deal with questions of injustice where they arise? So therefore, the question is to create alliances among those of us who understand we have to be allied and use our concerted effort both in a local area, on a broader area, to deal with these problems. We have to have more discussion of this kind of problem among ourselves. We just have to say, you're doing something. Okay, you're doing something, right? Well, other people are doing something. Let's get them together. Let's pull it together. Pull it together not only a regional area, but a state area, on a national area. What the Democratic Party has to become now around this vote is the pulling together of various so-called constituencies which have a common interest. For example, we have to pull together Hispanic Americans and so-called African Americans, the two largest minorities. Right? We have to pull together the whole show of people who have been divided and divided against each other and played against each other. We have to decide what our agreement is, what we're going to work for. Then apply that to a local situation. Therefore, you have it used to be the thing in the civil rights movement, the same thing. You have a local situation. What happened? You'd have people mobilizing to deal with a local situation from all over the country. And it was that force that got the victory. And the force was actually, as my friend Amelia said, she was in the middle of this voting rights problem from the beginning. She's now 93, she says 98, maybe so forth. She's still active. She's a leader. But it was the have-nots. It was people who had absolutely nothing. People who were almost derelicts, who were the hardcore of the fighters for voting rights in the South during that period. So we all have to understand that sometimes those of us who don't feel we have power may have an invisible power, the power to influence others. And the main thing is to bring us together. If we work together, we can work on programs.
I'm going to use poetic license and cheat a little bit on the list. Is Roy Jones here? Roy still here, or did he leave? Okay. How about Jay Pressey? Mr. Pressey?
How you doing?
Good.
My question is, well, I own MG Records. I flew up to Cleveland about 3.5 weeks ago from Texas. And, well, I already know the damage firsthand that Bush could do because I was there. It's, you know, not a lot of funding for urban business in Texas. And especially entrepreneurs and people who have a little sense, want to do something for the community. I had a large project that involved urban commitments in the middle of 3 hub zones for a CDBG block grant funding, and it was issued away, and the mayor pretty much wanted an under-the-table bid to give me the grant. What could be done about things like that on the city level and in the financial institution to be more involved in the urban community as far as financial development goes for urban communities to redevelop the neighborhoods and give some kind of morale to people who have good ideas for business and lucrative action?
We're going to need something like what Roosevelt did. We're going to need a group of a set of special legislation on the federal as well as state levels. The reason we need this is in order to do this thing in the extent that it's needed, and the need around the country is enormous. You can see it in every city in the country. That this is going to require some special funding. And the way to do it is to have a law which provides facilities which are mandated to seek out and to enlist capable people who are willing to undertake some of these things and do them, the way we did with the public projects under Roosevelt. So we will need a special project. The Kerry administration is going to find, to deal with the Depression, it needs a program of this type. And therefore the solution is to have a federal and state legislation in particular, which is enabling legislation whose impact is to ensure the provision of credit for things that are needed of this nature. It's going to be more needed all the time. But that's from the government standpoint, that's what you can do. Of course, on a practical level locally, that's the kind of thing you're talking about. I mean, that's as you described it. But to deal with this kind of situation typically around the country, you need a federal program with matching state programs, because when you get into local communities, the federal government shouldn't be too obvious there. It shouldn't be too much involved. But it should enable a state program, and a state program in turn should enable a local program. But we had that kind of hierarchy under Franklin Roosevelt. We need it again today.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Well, Texas has a program like that. And I went under that program. It's supposed to induce the bank by backing of the state to offer funds to enable other businesses to come up off seed money. Well, once you find out about something like that, and they see that me being maybe a minority of various nationalities because I'm Latin, they might have a problem with that, so they relinquish liability and participation in the program. I've seen 3 banks do this already, and it's not just been me. I haven't been the only one to go to the bank with this. I know an African-American guy with a net worth of $2 million, and they wouldn't even offer him $120,000 on a loan. It's a big problem. The only way that he got financed was because he knew the guy that was the general manager of the banking institution. You know, I'd like to get to the bottom of this, you know, from the ground up and find out why do they impede minority business.
Because they are what they are. They are what they are. And you have to have a mood shift in the country, and then things begin to work. My job is to make sure that the Kerry administration does mean a mood shift in the country, so things do begin to work. For example, let me give you an example of this. mood shift. You talk about Texas. All right, we have a program on Texas. It involves our involvement with Mexico. Now, as you probably know, coming from that neck of the woods, that most of the problems, the cross-border problems, are caused by a poverty on the side of the Mexican side and poverty and problems on the U.S. side. Most of these problems could be solved if, for example, Texas is in touch with about 5 states of northern Mexico. These states have offered Texas cooperation. And the cooperation is intended to relieve the drug problem. You have people who are in drugs coming across the border from Mexico simply because they have no income. You have that kind of problem. So you have all kinds of things, messes, which could be solved if we had more cooperation between Texas and these states in Mexico. The governor of Texas at one point was interested in this area, but then it has not yet worked. What we need is a change in attitude. And a change in attitude, I think, in this area would be, since the largest single minority, the politics of the border, the whole border area politics, as you probably know, from Mexico all the way to California, this whole area is this crazy issue of this Hispanic minority issue, which is being played across the border. And therefore, if we can have a project of development in Mexico, so that Mexico has some development projects, and we have some developments on the other side, we can regulate these problems to a great degree. We can manage them. Then we understand in areas such as Texas, where you have a recipient population, first or second generation, coming from Mexico, for example, we can understand the importance of accommodating to projects which will enhance that situation. I mean, if you can settle people in happily and peacefully in an area with aid of a project, you are solving a problem. And the problem is that idea does not exist. I mean, there were people, including Republicans, who were very serious about this idea of cooperation across border. But the thing just disappeared. And that's what you're talking about. I understand the problem. I think a change from the Kerry administration toward the area would result in some improvement of this. We do need large-scale projects all over the country, that is, even in minor projects, to start to deal with the infrastructure of this problem, as we did during the Depression. We have to do it now. And we have to rely upon finding volunteers who will actually undertake a lot of this work, particularly the local work. It's true, but we have to have a change of attitude first, which I think you said. You have to have a change of attitude, and then these things would often tend to work much more easily.
Roy Jones?
Yes, my name is Roy Jones. I'm with the labor union here, Labor's Local 310 in the construction industry. A lot of things you said was enlightening and very interesting, Mr. LaRouche. Only thing, you talk a little bit like an evolutionist, you know, and my question, just get down to it, do you believe in God, and shouldn't you put God first?
Belief in God is a very complicated question, because many people say they do, and then they find out the meaning and practice.
But you talk about faith too now.
Well, no, faith in God is the same thing. I mean, after all, I happen to know that the universe is created. I happen to know it's run by a creator. And I'm a creative person, so I recognize what that is. And I know that defines the essential law by which we behave. And I think in politics we should not get into denominational issues of religious belief. But the difference is this. When someone says that you don't have a mind, you're a monkey, you're just a guy who's a practical guy, and you don't have a creative mind, they're reducing you to the level of an animal. And how can you be in tune with the Creator if you do not see yourself as a creative person? How can you find yourself in a likeness to the Creator unless you can recognize creativity in yourself? And that the idea that we recognize creativity in ourselves and in other human beings gives us a bond and say we're all of the same. We all are human. We have a common human interest. There are no differences among us on this question. The problem in society today is we don't have this attitude. We don't, and the reason we don't have it is because most people don't know what creativity is. And they say God is the creator, but they don't know what creation is. They don't know what creativity is. And they don't know it because they cannot locate it inside themselves. And this is what has happened to us in this society. We are a society of people who I happen to know are all born with creative powers. They're all made in the image of the Creator. All. We should be treating them that way. But what's the condition of life? People are told, no, you don't have creative powers. You learn. You learn in school. You learn the lesson. You repeat after me. You don't have a belief that is there any continuity, immortal continuity between you and previous generations or future generations. You don't believe there's any active thing between you and the Creator. You may think that somehow you can beg and the Creator will bring you something good, but you don't have an idea of creation. And I think the problem here is in politics, we should not be getting into denominational politics as a standard of, because what happens then, if you say, let's keep church and state apart, you get the worst possible result. By assuming that religious belief is of a particular religious group, you deny the connection among all human beings of that type. And you deny the connection to the Creator himself. Because you have denied that in yourself and in the other person is a quality which is in the image of the Creator. It's on that basis that we have what we call natural law, the higher law. That if we believe that we are children of the Creator, having the powers of creativity, then we have obligations to each other based on a respect for that universality among us. And don't demand in politics more than that. If we can get that, we're way ahead as respect to what we have now.
Lynn, how are you doing on time?
Well, the time is doing fine. How are you doing? I think I should take a few more.
We're doing great.
Okay. I'll try to keep going.
Dave Martin.
Yes, hello, Mr. LaRouche. I agree with all of your rational approach to the needs of developing society, but I was questioning whether or not there's a need for a more independent movement away from the Democrats and whether they are a viable vehicle for bringing any of this about under the Democratic Leadership Council control of the Democratic Party, and the fact that all of the even moderately anti-war candidates had been gagged at the Democratic Convention to eliminate any kind of an alternative. And I think that Mr. Kerry has, in some cases, tried to out-Bush Bush. You know, I agree that Bush has got to be defeated and that we know what he's about. And the reason I would question Kerry is that he has, in some cases, been more saber-rattling during the debates than Bush himself. Not that anyone could outdo Bush in that department. I think that is simply a matter that more and more people have shown, according to the polls, they're against this war after the propaganda and brainwash wore off, that he held his tongue while Kerry was saber-rattling against Iran and North Korea, even beyond Iraq, and saying that we've got to win. Well, we don't have to win a dirty war. Winning a dirty war is even worse than losing it. And I was listening to a lady, Lisa Lipscomb, the lady on Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11 yesterday at a university, and she said she's giving conditional support to Kerry But after the election, if and when he gets it, she's going to be right in his face if he continues Bush's policies and Bush's warmongering. And another person who accompanied her, I had very suspicions about him because he was less conditional in his support for Kerry, and he supposedly in reassuring us that Kerry would be a good alternative to Bush, said that he had inside knowledge that it's possible that his advisor will be, of all people, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the spider at the center of the web for this whole Eurasia grand chess game takeover of even before the present neocons in the Bush administration had, come upon this idea, and the financier of the, the terrorist Mujahideen. So I just wondered, should we put more of our eggs in an independent labor basket or a socialist movement rather than relying on the Democrats?
Well, Dave, I'm a very independent person, as you may know. I have a record of independence in the Democratic Party, which is, I think, is almost unrivaled. The connection I have is largely to Franklin Roosevelt. Because Franklin Roosevelt, not that I'm a worshiper of Franklin Roosevelt, but Franklin Roosevelt represented a change in our course of action as a nation, in foreign policy as well as domestic, which saved the nation and actually prevented the takeover of the world by fascism. I mean, the world would have succumbed to fascism without the intervention of the United States and the preparation for the intervention by Roosevelt. Also, Roosevelt, you took at the legislation which had been destroyed, especially by Brzezinski, say between 1977 and 1981. Regulation was destroyed. All kinds of things on which this economy depended. The agriculture was destroyed on this basis. Well, this guy is bad news. And in the Democratic Party, I've been an opponent of these guys because what happened is we had a change from... Look, I came back from the war in 1946. Came back from overseas service. When I got back, I found that the people I'd served with had changed. They were no longer what they were during the war. Truman had become president, and the right wing was charging under Truman's leadership. And Truman had brought into the system the Nazis that Allen Dulles and company dragged into the system. Truman had brought into the system some of the bankers who had financed Hitler from the beginning and who'd been involved in the conspiracies of plot against Roosevelt in 1934. So therefore, I've been fighting against this all the time. I've gotten into a lot of trouble fighting against this. But I continue to fight. And my view of politics, you don't get a guaranteed contract that something is going to work. You stay in and you fight. And I fought all the time. That's why the first president I've endorsed, for Democratic president candidate I've endorsed, is Kerry. Why? Well, because it was pretty impossible in the choices. Carter, because of Brzezinski and the Trilateral Commission, which I understood. Mondale, because he was worse. Then they had the case of Clinton. I wasn't sure about Clinton because of the Democratic Leadership Council, which I call it Southern fried fascism. I wasn't sure. But I got to work with Clinton in a certain manner of speaking, got to know him, know his weaknesses, know his strengths. And, but Kerry, what came along, the choice was, if Bush is reelected, no world. No United States, no world. I know what their plans are. I know what the direction of thinking is. Bush is planning to go to war against Iran. He's planning to send Sharon into war against Iran. The U.S. has apparently supplied the missiles to Israel for the attack on Iran, which would then be actually a U.S.-sponsored attack. The U.S. is committed to an attack on North Korea with nuclear warheads. The United States is committed to wars in Southeast Asia and so forth. The U.S. is conducting, with Brzezinski's help, wars in the Caucasus. One of our major problems is Brzezinski's influence over the Southern Caucasus, or the Northern Caucasus. And Brzezinski's a bad guy. Madeleine Albright and Holbrooke are problems. Therefore, I know this, so I'm staying in and fighting.
I agree, Mr. LaRouche, but I just hope that people will not develop a tribal mentality that, you know, this is the only choice we have, and I guess we have no choice, but to not develop the idea that because we voted for him, we have to now support him if he continues in Bush's disastrous policies. So, you know, too many people, if it's a D or an R before the name, before the war, will support it based on whether it's a Democratic or Republican-led war and fascist policies. So I'm saying I agree with you, but we have to continue to fight after he's elected.
I'll fight.
Lynn will fight, we will fight, and you should participate in our efforts here in Ohio, which will be continuing, I assure you, following November 2nd. We're not going anywhere. Lynn, I have a question from the internet. James Gavitt asks, how can the next president best prevent an Israeli bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities? What is the best response to Iran's potential nuclear ambitions, and how should we deal with Israel's nuclear arsenal in the context of seeking regional stability?
Yeah. Well, we've got to do a number of things. First of all, the basic objective of U.S. policy, and my policy in particular, is to achieve a security agreement among the nations of Southwest Asia. This includes Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iran, and the Arab countries, including Egypt. What I propose in this direction has been accepted, received with a certain amount of gladness from leading people in the region. Now, the problem in this then comes down to the question, the big sticking point, and there will never be peace in the Middle East unless there's a settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Now, as far as we're concerned, since we're outsiders, that means that we don't care whether the Palestinians and Israelis have a separate nation or one nation. That's up to them. But we want an end to this conflict. We do not want Israel used as a pawn of its own right wing by people like the Bush administration. Because one has to understand that in reality, many people think that the United States is a pawn of Israel. It is not. Israel is a pawn of the British and United States. So therefore, if we control the government in Washington, that part is taken care of. Now, the problem comes otherwise. The problem comes in the way the United States is going to deal with the rest of the world. Kerry has said he plans to have an early meeting, if elected, with governments in Europe to discuss his policy. He's correct in that. That idea is a good idea. The point is that he's not going to get a successful agreement with Europe on policy unless he says, I'm not going to put Holbrooke or Brzezinski or Madeleine Albright in my administration. He cannot succeed unless he, because Russia knows that Brzezinski is behind the assault on Russia, which included the Beslan terrorist attack. And Putin has made that clear. Putin has supported Bush precisely over this issue of the United States, through Brzezinski, supporting that kind of operation in the North Caucasus. So Kerry's going to have to pay attention to that. If we bring Russia in, with it, and India will come in automatically in its own way, not the way we want it, but its own way. If we bring Europe into the picture with the idea of a Southwest Asia security policy, and if we make clear that we are not, as a nation, going to tolerate any more of this use of Israeli blackmail against Palestinians, we want a peace settlement now. We want a just settlement for both parties. I look at this as tantamount to 1648, when Europe was engaged in religious war for 30 years at that time. A peace agreement was made called the Treaty of Westphalia. That peace agreement worked. It's the basis for international law today. I would propose that the Treaty of Westphalia concept be applied to the Middle East situation, particularly to the Palestinian and Israeli situation, that international guarantors, including the United States, be provided to ensure that a peaceful resolution, probably a two-state solution, for the Israeli-Palestinian problem be provided. But this one more thing is required. There is a shortage of water in that area. There is not enough water resources now to sustain the entire population in life, the people who are living in the area. Therefore, we have to have a mass desalination program and other economic development programs for the area involving Israel and Palestine and surrounding territory to ensure that you have a viable environment in which people will have the opportunity to live successfully at peace with one another. In the meantime, we have to come in with the guarantees. But that's the only way it's going to be achieved. It's not going to be achieved otherwise. I think I've indicated some of the hot spots and the problems in this thing.
Let me just announce that if you've just tuned in to this webcast, you are listening to a discussion with Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. He is speaking to a live audience at the Wyndham Hotel in downtown Cleveland. He's speaking to us from a studio in Northern Virginia. This meeting was sponsored by the LaRouche Political Action Committee. And you can access further information on the web at www.larouchepac.com. And if you're listening on the web, you can ask questions by email. The address is info@larouchepac.com. Is Robert Smith here? There he is.
Okay. I just need me. I look for jobs. I live in Cleveland. I just need a job. I need for job work and stuff. Job clean.
Job in Cleveland?
Yeah, I'm clean and stuff.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite understand you.
Okay, I just look for a job.
You're looking for a job.
In East Cleveland.
In East Cleveland. He's looking for a job. In East Cleveland.
Yeah.
One of the members of the Cleveland Council was just here.
Okay.
We can talk to him about it and see what we can do.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Edward Hill.
I want to thank you for this opportunity for us to be here and be able to ask these questions of you. My question is primarily a policy question about the different public works and infrastructure programs you've talked about. Me living here in Cleveland and having direct experience with the problems that we have. For example, my father was a former steel worker and he lost his job in the late 1990s before the millennium. And I seen him lose his job. I see, I like to classify the economy now as three sections of old work, like my father, manufacturing, industrial, new work, high-tech jobs, college education, and then no work. And the thing with old work is, with old work, the chances were President Bush talks about retraining these people for high-tech industries, high-tech jobs. That is really not completely feasible with a person that has worked 30, 20 years in an industrial job, and they have these skills that are still needed, and we need these skills to be used to rebuild our country. And then we have people that can't enter the new world because they don't have access to affordable education. They're born into urban poverty centers. And then we have the people in no work, and that just ends up going into the underground economy, the prison industrial complex. So it's a big catch-22 system. But my question to you is when Kerry wins, which I'm very confident that he will, I'm very confident that the Democrats will get the Senate. The House I can't say yet, but what kind of plan do you think would be good for infrastructure and public works in the first 4 years of Kerry's term? And also, would you have it be similar to the Kucinich proposal where he has a bill out there that is in committee still, where it's $50 billion loans interest-free to states and municipal governments over 10 years with the provision that they have to be used with the Buy America Act to use the American steel, American products to rebuild our economy. How do you see that starting off? Sorry it's so long.
No, Kucinich is a very interesting fellow. Sometimes he has some very good ideas. I think this is something which should be treated seriously, his proposal and legislation. Everything will help of that nature. We do need to build a constituency for this. I mean, with the new administration, we're going to have, for example, as I proposed back during the early part of the year, and Kerry picked up on some of it. I said, look, specifically, what this country needs is 10 million jobs. If we have 10 million jobs divided among infrastructure and other things, which we can create by federal credit, if we can do that, we can rebuild this economy and begin to fix what's broken. That's the general approach. 50%, at least, in the long term, 50% of the total development will be in infrastructure. It has to be. Because, you know, you're talking about investments which have a life, a financial life, an economic life, of 40 years, 50 years, or 25 years. So this, you cannot, and you pay this off piece by piece as you go along. So this adds up very quickly to 50% of the total economy, the current economy, is actually involved in investment in maintaining and creating infrastructure. We have lost in the United States, we have lost a tremendous amount of infrastructure. You can see it around. We have also lost an intangible infrastructure like the condition of our cities. In the post-war period, the United States made an insane move of moving away from the cities we had, which were admittedly decaying in a large degree, into suburban areas. We came up with suburbia. We've now spread the population into larger areas, or at least we did, around suburbia. We left the cities neglected. We came back to gentrify the cities somewhat, but the idea of a city as a unit of functioning where you had residents, you had facilities, you had employment, all in the same area. You know, the idea of the industrial city would have around it, around the circumference, would have the heavy industrial production. And people could get to their industrial jobs or various industrial jobs by mass transport or efficient transport day by day. They could get home often at noontime for lunch. They certainly could be at home in the evening time. We had schools were nearby in neighborhoods. We had medical facilities were nearby, convenient. That has gone. We've lost that. We have now an insane system that's costing a great deal in transportation. People are traveling more times on the highway that they turn into parking lots than you can shake a stick at in concentrated areas. So we have to rebuild the cities. We have to build up a new power system. We have to build a water management system, that kind of thing. Education systems. We have to build up the healthcare system. We've destroyed it. If you just look at what we've lost under HMO since 1973, we've lost the ability to take care of our people. So we're going to have to invest in that area. Then we're going to have to concentrate on new kinds of industries as new industries. These will be, in part, two things. We need the essential machine tool industry. The machine tool industry today will mean, as it did even before we began to shut it down, it means that the same old skills, essentially, with new technologies built into them, are added to the machine tool industry, which means that the people who are skilled in machine tool industry can still be profitable and up to date, because you just mix the labor force so you have some of the new technologies along with the old technologies. Right? You've got people as a reservoir who still have those skills. You don't have those skills in other countries, many other countries. You have them here. So our job is to re-employ people, to build up these small, closely held firms, like machine tool shops and shops like that, and to get contracting companies in, so they can bid on getting in on the building of infrastructure. In other words, there's a division between, you want 10 million jobs, we need 10 million jobs in this country. Half of it will be in infrastructure. 5 million jobs in infrastructure. And we have to build up another 5 million jobs in the private sector. And this does not, the IT industry has gone too far. The IT industry of the early 90s was a hoax in a large degree. It was a gimmick. It was a gimmick to try to cover up the problems of the economy. The Federal Reserve System put a lot of money in the IT industry. Then in 1970, the whole industry began to go bankrupt and belly up. It still exists, but the fact that it was exaggerated in its importance and effectiveness was made clear at that point. We do need high technology. What we need is scientific technology, not mathematical technology. And scientific technology means experiment. It means working with material to develop physical principles. And that's what we've gone away from. We've gone away from experimental work, where you actually, if you look at just take a look at the history of great experiments which made great discoveries. Look at the design of the experiment, made by the experimenter, on which some of the greatest discoveries of physical principle were made. They look pretty much more like a machine tool shop than they look like a computer firm, a computer operator. And those skills our population have. It's the brains they have, the way they used to solve problems, the way they understand problems they did solve on the job, especially in the tool-making area. Now, these people are still needed. We simply have to create the 10 million jobs we need, and we have to sort out the skills among the people we have and the places where they can be done and get them back to work.
William Spizak.
Hello, Mr. LaRouche. I have a question and a point. First, the question. Would the neocons try something aggressive in the Middle East, say if Kerry were to win between the election and the inauguration? The second is a point I'd like to make to the lady who was undecided. When we had the womanizer Clinton, we were hiring police, fire, paramedics, and our hospitals weren't closing. I'd like to point that out as well. Thank you.
Well, the neocons we've never heard what the neocons are. The neocons are simply a special breed of what we used to call Nazis or fascists. People don't like to use the term because you're talking about Wolfowitz, you're talking about Cheney, you're talking about so and so. These guys are fascists. Now, I know what fascists are. I'm a specialist in knowing what these guys are. And what's their purpose? Their purpose is actually to turn the clock of history back, to destroy the modern nation state, the modern citizenship. What will they do? Well, Wolfowitz and the rest of them, you've seen their performance in the Middle East. You've seen what they've done in Iraq. They went in there with a fraud, as you probably have observed. There was no reason to move into Iraq as a military operation. None. The only actual issue was the question of the disputed issue of weapons of mass destruction, which we now know did not exist, which we did not believe existed at that time. But we had to get inspectors back in there to settle that question. The inspectors were kept from moving back in there. Instead, George went ahead and started the war because Cheney wanted the war. There was no reason for it. The situation in Afghanistan today is worse than when we went in there. Yes, you have Karzai and the warlords have a temporary agreement. But the drug pouring out of Afghanistan is greater than ever. The Taliban are about to come back into power under a new name, under the Karzai regime. In the meantime, the drug trafficking coming out of Afghanistan is the major source of terrorism in the Caucasus and other areas. So this whole mess is such. The neocons, will they do anything? Yes. They're capable of anything. Can you stop them? That's the question. We can stop them. If the U.S. government wants to stop the neocons from running an operation in the Middle East, with what I know of the people I know in Europe and elsewhere, we can stop them.
Lynn, we still have quite a long list of questioners here in the room at the Wyndham, and I also have quite a long list of questions that have come in by the internet. I'll ask you one, sort of as a summary of several of the questions that have come in by the internet having to do with agriculture. Each questioner is approaching the question in a slightly different way. One is identifying the takeover of agriculture by corporate farming, and one of the implications being destruction of the soils and poisoning the waterways, fruits, vegetables, and so forth. The other is a question which comes at the same issue. The questioner says that I used to embrace the Malthusian model and supported population reduction programs and so forth, but he now recognizes, thanks especially to your writings, that there is a concept of man taking dominion over nature, and that does not mean destroying the environment. So, but both of these questioners ask the same thing. What would you do, what's your proposal for the government policy towards farmers and agriculture?
Okay. First of all, the corporate farm is a disaster. It's an environmental disaster, a biological disaster. Because what we're doing is we're increasing reliance upon a few standardized types of food products. And we're standardizing these for the international market. Result is, if something happens to one of these varieties, an attack, a disease that attacks one of these varieties, that whole element of the food chain is taken out. So we used to have more varieties of apples, more varieties of potatoes, more varieties of everything. Now this was based on a specialized farming, high-tech farming, of the type we used to have before 1977. These were closely held family farms, or multiple family farms, which in terms of farming would run, say, around 400 acres. They were mixed farming, not monoculture. And they were very productive. They involved a lot of steel, a lot of technology. They're gone now. The corporate farm now mass produces foodstuffs and reduces the varieties of things we have which exist. So that if one of our varieties gets sick, we would have other varieties available from other sources. So therefore, I'm for the return to the family farm of this type, which means a ranching operation of a couple thousand acres, or a family or interfamily farm of several hundred acres in direct farming. Because that is our best security. First of all, it is idiotic to haul food by transportation all over the world. It is much better to have an integrated society, which you have cities which have around them industrial development and other specialized development, and around the cities to have agricultural development. So now you will find, for example, we used to have slaughterhouses which were close to cities. So you could have a specialty kinds of products available in large degree from local farms into the cities. You were less reliant upon international resources. Yes, you would have seasonal reliance. You know, winter comes, you don't grow it anymore, but you would get something from other parts of the world. But that's the form of agriculture we need. We need a high-tech in the sense, high-tech in terms of what the old agronomists understood as high-tech, producing a rich variety of products which are less vulnerable to diseases, going back to farms that are functional, like the several hundred acre family farm outside a city. To have ranching, which on a larger scale generally runs to a couple thousand acres in a more remote area. But to have diversity, genetic diversity in crops of all types for purposes of security in food supply. To have, as much as possible, to have food supply available from areas surrounding urban areas. To have food supplies near to where people consume the food. And if we move in that direction and move back to a rational agriculture, see, we're now at a point, we're about to lose the last family farmers. The last family farmers are now in their 70s or older. Many, when they get older, they sort of quit farming. But they're in their 70s, their 60s and 70s. The younger members of the family have not gone into farming. We are losing the species of the family farmer, the high technology family farmer. So I think it's a matter of national security interest, among other things, to increase the supply and the encouragement of family farming, and to increase the emphasis on diversity of crop types, diversity of species in crop types and varieties. Just simply as a matter of biological security for our food supply.
Lynn, I'm going to make that the last question and ask if you have closing remarks, because we're all going to be there's a certain amount of anxiety, let's put it that way, in anticipation of what is going to happen on Tuesday. And I think everyone here would like to get some further words from you about the importance of the turnout of the vote on Tuesday.
Well, there's no question about that. You've got to get the mass turnout. The only way to deal with the kind of fraud that I see coming out of the Cheney apparatus, and it is largely Cheney, this fraud can only be dealt with by a landslide turnout of vote. So you have to overwhelm the polls with people who are going to vote. And that's the only way that you can effectively defend your ballot against the amount of fraud, which is going to be, without doubt, is going to be pulled by the Cheney gang. I mean, these guys are fascists, and you must expect the kind of treatment you would get from fascists from them. The other thing beyond that, we have to have a perspective which goes beyond the mere election of the president. We are going to have, as I said, the greatest economic crisis the world has known. It's worse than the 1930s. It's coming on now. It will be here. The Democratic Party, because of a cultural change which was introduced during about 40 years ago, has lost the kind of economic skills, political economic skills, which existed formerly. You used to have people understood industry, understood agriculture. You have a diminishing number of those people in the party organization. The society is not oriented to that. We're going to have to go back to a reindustrialization policy. Now, for that, my function is going to be, the primary ongoing function, or the function of this Political Action Committee, will be to provide what we couldn't provide today. We don't have the facilities to transmit by internet all the kinds of illustrations which I would require for this purpose. The principles of physical economy, and to supply that knowledge as an arming of the Democratic Party, as a political party, the arming of the nation and the party with the principles of physical economy, which is what we have to apply to go beyond the simple precedents of Roosevelt in order to deal with the problem that's going to face President Kerry in the coming year. So we are going to be here. We are not a campaign pack that is going to vanish with the election or shortly after the election. We are going to increase our activity as a pack, as a part and a service to the Democratic Party. Our major product will be to deal with these questions on which we have special skills, which is the skill of the science of physical economy, which is necessary to deal with many of the problems we have to face. We're going to be here. So we need to get everybody out we can to the election. Don't even worry who they're going to vote for. You turn them out, you know what the result is going to be. You know that for every person under 29, probably 65% of them will turn out and vote for Kerry anyway. You get people over 50, over 60, you'll tend to get a pro-Kerry vote among these people. You'll get many Republicans who don't want to vote for Bush, many of them. There are many people who said, I will never support that man again. I cannot do that again, because they're men of conscience, men and women of conscience. We hope that they will do something good in this process. But turn everybody out. But that only begins the job. It doesn't end it. We're going to have to rebuild the country. And my particular responsibility with this pack in that process is to make sure the Democratic Party has that resource it needs from me to deal with this problem.
Lynn, thank you very much. Thank you very much. That concludes this international webcast and the town meeting here at the Wyndham. All of those of you who are in attendance here are welcome to stick around, talk to us, get your literature, marching orders at the tables outside, and we'll try and answer your questions as best we can. Those of you who were not able to get your questions asked, if you will write them down, these questions will be delivered to Mr. LaRouche, and you will receive an answer. I guarantee it. Thank you very much.